Welcome to the Strange Stories of Music. I'm your host, Leo Thompson, and today we're talking about one of the strangest musicians ever, Frank Zappa. You may know Frank Zappa for being a leader in the avant garde rock scene and one of the most famous rock musicians of the 70s and 60s, but before all of that, he was a young kid growing up in Baltimore, Maryland. In his childhood, his dad would become a chemical scientist working for the U.S. Army. And this would have a profound effect on his later life because his dad would be known for going back home with mercury filled lab equipment and bringing it home for a young Frank Zappa to play with. And Frank Zappa said in multiple interviews that he would take out the small bits of mercury still left in the lab equipment and put it all around and play with it and uh, put it on his bed and like roll with it on him. And later in life, this would probably give him a multitude of problems. He would be suffering from asthma, earaches, and sinus problems multiple times in his mid-teens to earlier in childhood. And a doctor would treat his all his sinus problems by entering a pellet of radium into each of his Zappa's nostrils. And at the time, nobody knew about the dangers of even small amounts of radiation and mercury exposure. And now it's most commonly believed that this led to his death from cancer in the 90s. Um, but after his early, even in his early childhood, Zappa would begin his musical journey early. He would read books on music theory that he would check out through the local library, and he would listen to many avant-garde composers like Igor Stravinsky, Anton Webern, and Edgar Vars. All of these composers would mainly be known for their more out there approach to music, and especially Edgar, of the most out there of all of them, would be known for using like kind of a wall of sound and featuring a lot of songs with like harsh horns and just very harsh noise that would make him stick out there to a lot of other composers at the time. And he'd put weird sounds and all sorts of strange instruments you just normally wouldn't hear. And that became one of his main musical influences in the time of his younger days. And in 1965, actually, he would start his first band. They would have their very first gig in May of that year. They would first be known as the Mothers, but after they would get signed in 1966, they'd be asked why they are called the Mothers. And when Frank Zappa explained that it was short for the explicit uh, mother, I'm sure you can guess what it is. Um, they would then have to change their name to the Mothers of Invention to stay away from that. Now, this Frank Zappa didn't like this move because he's been quoted many times talking about how he is doesn't think there's any such thing as a dirty word. He said once that dirty words were things made up to keep people stupid. Whether or not you believe in that's another thing. But he would fight many times throughout his career with the labels, and he hated anything that would mark an album as explicit. When they made the stickers of fighting against albums with dirty content in them, he was some of the first people who got their albums put on with the parental advisory suggested stickers, and he would go to Congress and he would try to fight against that multiple times. And but I'm getting ahead of myself here. In 1966, when they would get signed, they would also make their first album this year. The Mothers of Invention would make their really, I would almost say, hit record Freak Out. The album wasn't like a massive success for its time, but since now has gained a lot of critical praise. And back then, it had a lot of critical praise from people in the LA freak scene, which is more of just a avant garde scene. And they would get even more critical acclaim and even more fame from people in LA, and this time a lot of fame from people in Europe with their album We're Only in It for the Money. This album had a very striking cover art where it parodied the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's record, and it had a bunch of weird out there famous people that you wouldn't normally see on an album. And instead of a bed of flowers making up the name Mothers of Invention, it was a bed of like old fruit and meat. Just a really striking cover, and the band had, Zappa was like in a dress, just really uh, out there things for the 60s. And in 1970, they would make what many consider their best album yet, and their Mothers of Invention's best album of all time with Weasels Ripped My Flesh. A bit about their title. Um, this album also had a very striking cover art with a weasel ripping a guy's flesh, a little cartoon guy. And the album had mixed reception. I think Rolling Stones at the time gave it a 4 out of 5. Pretty high praise from them. But I remember reading, and there were some other publications that weren't big fans of it. And it had a bunch of avant-garde jazz and just jazz in general, and that would allow them to really hit it big in Europe, where that scene was becoming more of a thing. In fact, in 1971, they would release another album with the name of 200 Motels. This album lost a lot of its relevance today, and it's a really big album. It's like 4 sides or something like that. And they would go on a tour for this album in Europe because it's another avant-garde jazz and just general jazz type album, jazz rock. And that time in Europe, that was a big hit. I think they hit #1 on the billboards for a lot of European countries. And one stop in this, they started a tour in June of 1971. And on on December 4th of 1971 would start their very first serious setback for the band and for Frank Zappa in general. This is where probably a majority of our show will lie today. Now, let me set the scene for you. The Mothers of Inventions, the Mothers of Invention, were at the Casino de Monteux in Switzerland. Now, this casino was known for its great design. It was this giant, like, wooden building that had like a red, like almost like red velvet looking hue to it. Really nice looking wood structure. It was just a really great looking piece of European architecture. And it became kind of a second home to a lot of bands, and mainly a lot of jazz and rock bands. They had they had many famous jazz and rock bands play there, and on this night it was no different. When the Mothers of Invention came to play, it was a sold out show. Not a single seat was available. And at this show, actually, there would be most of Deep Purple there, as they planned to record next week and decided to go ahead and check out this Frank Zappa show. The album Deep Purple was going to record there was actually their most famous album, the Machine Head record. I'm sure many of you know Machine Head for some of its big hits on it, like Smoke on the Water and Highway Star. Many of the classic Deep Purple songs come from there. But on this show, it was well received by the fans. A lot of fans were really, digging it. And they all were liking it. And they were doing so good, they, were demanding for an encore after it ended. So Frank Zappa and his band go out to do an encore. And while the Mothers are just about to start to play, one fan, for some reason, decided to bring a flare. He shot the flare right as soon as the band began to. He shot the flare as soon as the band began their encore. Right when Frank Zappa started his guitar work for their next song they were going to play, this fan would shoot the flare. It wouldn't hit anybody, luckily, but it would hit behind them and start what began as a small fire on one of the amps. Frank Zappa sees this, and his immediate reaction to this is to say, "Fire! Live in person, we have Arthur Brown." Now, for those who don't know, Arthur Brown was a man who was famous on this time for setting himself on fire while singing a song called Fire. Shortly after this, Frank Zappa would then get on the mic and tell everybody to leave in an orderly fashion as this fire was getting bigger and bigger. Now, little did they know how big this would get, because shortly after he said that, that fire gained way more traction because it was able to set almost all the band's equipment on fire and started setting the wall behind him on fire. Because if you remember from earlier, this entire building is made out of complete wood. So this whole building is just starting to go up in flames. Frank Zappa and the band are trying to get to save some of their equipment that is yet to be set on fire and save their guitars and instruments, but they soon realize that this is a foolish effort as people are starting to run out as quickly as they can, and they see how big the fire is getting. They have no choice but to just drop their instruments and drop their equipment they're trying to take out and just run. They all get out of there, they all run, and they just watch this building get set on fire, and in about 30 minutes, the entire building is just reduced to ash. Now, this is pretty bad for them because they had about $50,000 worth of equipment in there. And you may be saying, well, hey, they're a band, $50,000 ain't that much. But that's in 1971. And after doing some quick calculations, that would be equivalent to about $388,000 in 2026 money. So as a band that was semi-successful, I mean, they were able to do well, but they didn't have a crazy amount of money. They would meet in their hotel room to discuss whether or not, they should even keep going. Because at this point, they realized, well, we just lost about $400,000 worth of equipment. That's going to be almost all of our money, and we're probably going to lose money on this tour. They took a vote, and it was almost unanimous to keep going. And so they decided to keep going. They bought a bunch of equipment. They borrowed some too. They had to take a break, and they had to postpone their show at the Rainbow Theatre in London. Well, they went back to it, and it's been about 6 days, I believe, after this fire, and they're doing their first show since the fire. They're playing at the Rainbow Theatre, as I mentioned, in London. Now, they've only rented this gear, and, it starts off pretty well. The show is pretty lively. It isn't completely sold out, but it is close to it. And, they start an encore. And they decided to change it up this time on the encore. They decided to do a cover. They do a cover of the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand. And their signature Mothers of Invention / Zappa style. They make it a little zany on this one. And right when they're about to start playing, Zappa starts singing, I Want to Hold Your Hand. Right as he starts, getting into like the chorus here, this enraged man jumps up on stage and quickly goes to Zappa and pushes him off the stage into the orchestra pit that is filled with concrete and is about a 10-foot drop, I believe. Now, he falls into this orchestra pit. He falls down face first, not face first. He falls down face down. He is like completely slumped. His legs are broken. The band just instantly thinks, after looking at the body of Zappa, that he just died on stage. And the fan gets tackled. He gets taken away. The people go check on Zappa, and luckily he lived, but he suffered extreme trauma and injuries to his back, his leg, and neck, and as well as a crushed larynx, which ultimately it caused his voice to drop a third even after healing. Now forever changed how he sang. Because if you listen to a lot of these Mothers of Invention, he has a bit of a higher range that he can do. And he just has a more impressive singing voice. But then you go listen to the Zappa records, and on those records, like on Montana and Uncle Remus, which I think is his most popular song on Spotify, you'll just hear him kind of talking in these low voices and not really trying to push it at all. And sometimes it doesn't really sound like he's singing. He tries to let his guitar do the singing for him a lot of times after this. And I mean, that's all because of this attack. And after this attack, obviously they had to cancel a large part of that tour, but Zappa had to use a wheelchair for an extended period of time. And, they couldn't tour for over half a year. And for this band, after losing that much money worth of equipment, that about $400,000, and not being able to recuperate from the rest of this tour, it almost bankrupted the Mothers of Invention. They were, probably the closest they ever did to canceling it right then and there. Um, Luckily for the rest of the Mothers, they were, since they couldn't do anything without Zappa, they formed a new band, the called the Flo and Eddie's Band, as they would just kind of, they made a couple songs, but they mainly just did some, Mothers of Invention stuff to really recuperate the cost of all that money they lost. And in 1972, in September, it's been quite a long time since he last did anything. He was able to return on stage, but he still had to wear a leg brace, and he had a pretty bad limp, and he couldn't stand for that long on stage either. And the main reason of this is because one leg apparently would heal. It took way longer for one of the legs to heal than the other, and it resulted in a lot of back pain for him that he'd have for a long time of his life. Um, and that's really like the big part of this, is that the stuff that happened in this one week lived on in infamy. The fire, I mentioned Deep Purple was there. That fire would inspire their song "Smoke on the Water," their number one hit, and probably their most famous song of all time. And it would also change their whole album, Machine Head, because they had to wait longer to record it. They got to rewrite some stuff. And, originally that song, of course, "Smoke on the Water" wasn't even going to be on that album, but inspired them to write it because of the fire. And without Frank Zappa getting attacked at the Rainbow Theater, he wouldn't have focused on his guitar work as much, and you wouldn't have heard, some of the greatest guitar solos of all time that he has. I mean, if you want to hear great Frank Zappa guitar work, hear the solo off of Montana, off of Muffin Man. They all have weird names, so stay with me with this one, with these. Um, I mean, just any of the guitar work off of Apostrophe is great. Like, he has amazing solo. I mean, the solos on Hot Rats. We wouldn't have a lot of these solos, or at least some of them, without him having to rely less on his singing, rely more on his guitar playing. And that's probably what made him one of the best guitarists in the world. And you made me thinking, wow, that's really crazy. There's no way this Zappa guy gets any weirder. Well, you'd be kind of wrong. Zappa, after leaving the Mothers of Invention and then just doing his own solo stuff, would make 60 albums while he was alive. And he only started really doing solo work from the 1970s until the early 90s when he died. So in just about 30 years, he made 60 records, doing 2 albums a year almost. And during this, he would kind of implement his like legendary and pretty influential style where he would mix studio and live recordings into one thing to make a wholly like new original song. And he did this a lot. He would, basically record everything he did live. In fact, he even record the Fire. There's that would later get released after his death. Um, but he would mix in like his live guitar work with his studio guitar work, and then try to just make something new. It would make usually a weird sounding sound, but it's Frank Zappa. That's what he liked to do. He would even make his own record company, and they would sign his childhood friend, Captain Beefheart, who is someone we'll talk about on the next episode of this show. A rather infamous individual, and they would collaborate multiple times. He's on the track I mentioned previously of Muffin Man, and he would just stay very relevant. He would make his most famous album in '74 with Apostrophe, and then make Hot Rats in the '70s, and which is also a really infamous, not infamous, famous album of his. And it would be considered one of the best albums of all time, one of the best jazz records of all time, something praised by music critics, and it's still talked about today. I mean, just a lot of his legacy still lives on today, with just like any of the weird style music you hear around. Yeah, I'm talking about all these records here. Um, he also, after his death, he had so many recordings and so many of these live recordings, especially that his family and estate would end up releasing another 60. So all in all, he has about 120 records filled to the brim with songs. I mean, some of these are quadruple albums. There's 4 discs on them. And I real quick just want to go over with the last couple minutes that we have here, just some of our standout Zappa picks to really get anybody into the Zappa listening mood, and just show some people some of his best stuff. I would talk about Uncle Remus being one of his classics. Peaches on Regalia, that's another one. Watermelon and Easter Hay. Um, Montana, I'm the Slime. Um, just really anything off of Apostrophe, Joe's Garage, or Hot Rats, you really can't go wrong. Those are standout albums, and in fact, he would be really influential with just rock music in general, because the Mothers of Inventions, one of their first couple albums, would be the second ever rock album after Blonde on Blonde came out in the '60s, and just really helping prove that double albums could sell. But let's get back to the stories real quick. I mentioned this earlier, but when Zappa went to Congress to testify against the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center, um, they were attempting, for anyone who doesn't know, to do a crackdown on music and kind of really censor anything that they considered just, I'm trying to find a good word for it. I would just say like almost like unholy, or anything they considered just too out there or too damaging to the youth. Now Zappa would argue, it's the parents' jobs to do this, and they don't have anything. They don't really have any real say in it. Like, what does one person consider bad, the other person doesn't. And he, in fact, would make a pretty famous line in this Congress case. He would say, "Bad facts make bad laws." And he would also say, and people who write bad laws are, in my opinion, more dangerous than songwriters who celebrate sexuality, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of thought. And the right to due process for composers, performers, and realtors are in peril if the PMRC and the major labels consummate this nasty bargain. That was a real famous line that came out of that, and he became kind of like a hero to all the people who, music was under crackdown from this. And it was a lot of music back then that they would, end up trying to go after. And, he was a big say in trying to, stop that and help people out. And, basically saying, if you do this, you're going to be ruining people. Like he was saying, I couldn't make it if stuff like this existed back in the '60s. And, he's probably right. And, now we know that stuff didn't really ended up mattering, and that the kids got a hell of the music anyways, so it didn't really matter. And Zappa would be known as a bit of a perfectionist. There's many stories about him doing 8 hours of guitar playing every single day, even while on the road. And for those who don't know what it's like to play guitar, just play an instrument in general, that's insane. You have to just be a complete different level of musician to be able to do that much. And, just looking at Zappa and him being a musician at the '70s at the time, and, doing all this sort of crazy stuff, many assume that he was, on drugs, that he'd be at least doing, that he'd be doing some type of drug, maybe it's coke or maybe it's something like that. They think, it was very heavily rumored that he was on a lot of drugs just because of the way he acted and just the weirdness of his music and his vibe. In fact, he appeared on SNL and is famously pretty bad at it. He was really bad at acting. And one of the sketches, though, on it was that a group of roadies offer Frank Zappa drugs, and he's like comically anti-drug, and he like lectures them, and they're like, "Well, this is surprising. I didn't think Frank Zappa would be like this." Um, but it turns out that's how he actually was in real life. He refused to ever take drugs because of how hard his music was to play, and wouldn't hire any musicians who were on drugs. Like when he would do his own solo stuff, he wouldn't hire a single session musician or a single touring musician to be with him if he knew that they were taking a lot of drugs at the time, because just of how hard his music is to play. He wanted everyone to be aware, and he would lose it if somebody wouldn't play to the like perfect model. And now we can see a lot of these signs. It's like maybe he had some autism or something similar to that. But at the time he was just seen as a bit of a weird guy. Another rapid fire quick weird story here. Frank Zappa was last album was also maybe the weirdest album I've ever listened to before this Captain Beefheart record we'll talk about next week. It's all recorded on a single instrument, and it's called a Sinclair, and it's like a very early digital synth and like sampling system as well. And it was also supposed to be used as like a music workstation. It was kind of like an all-in-one, almost like early computer. And it was produced from the 70s into the 90s. And I wouldn't, wasn't used by a crazy amount of like famous musicians, but it's just this giant machine. And Frank Zappa saw this and he went, "That's it." And so the last studio album at least he ever made, was this album called Jazz from Blank. Can't say the actual name here, but I think you can guess. And it was only recorded on this instrument. There's nothing else in it. There's samples of other instruments, but it's only from the Sinclair. And all of this comes together to make one of the weirdest albums you'll ever hear. It's like if you were listening to the Mario soundtrack on acid. After hearing how anti-drug he is, you would think that I got that 100% wrong after listening to this record. It is a very strange one, to say the least. Another quick little rapid fire story here before we wrap up. One of the weirdest parts of his legacy is that he's kind of responsible for the popularity of that Valley Girl accent. I'm sure you know that one, where the one where it's like, "Oh my God," that type of stuff. That's gonna live on. He released a song called Valley Girl where it, just made fun of people who had that accent in the LA valleys. And that kind of, it was just one specific valley really where that accent was really at. And it just kind of spread because of that song. And also like, it showed that kind of a unique, to say the least, accent. And it became used in a bunch of movies and TV shows, but really the first big example of media in it is from this song. And it just kind of goes to show the weirdness and just overall influence that Frank Zappa had that many people don't even realize. And after this, I hope that after hearing these crazy stories, I hope that people go check them out. And this has been the Strange Story of Music podcast. And I hope you all check out some Zappa. Check out some of those albums I recommended earlier, and I hope you enjoyed the story of his terrible week and other random stories like that. And we'll see you next week when we talk about Captain Beefheart and his crazy album known as Trout Max.